apologize for not being able to present my talk in French. I studied French in high school, but it's been a while, unfortunately, and I studied French in college. And although I haven't, I'm very thankful to have been to Montreal now. This is my third time, and I have connections that go way back with Denis Bouchard. He and I were both at the University of Texas for 1 year. We overlapped and got to know Amari Parizeau over the last years. I also have kind of a connection that most people, kind of secret connection to Quebec French that is kind of surprising. And that is when I was first in graduate school, I worked on an outlier of Quebec French in Missouri. So there was still a French dialect from the 18th century spoken in Missouri, south of St. Louis. So in a little town called Mier, so old mines. And unfortunately it's a dying dialect and probably is an extinct dialect of French at this point. All the speakers at that time when I was working on it years ago were in their 50s and 60s and 70s. And I really kind of doubt that it's still there at this point. But anyway, so I feel very privileged to be back here in the home of Quebec French and to be talking to you. So I'm going to talk about language modality and the acquisition of signed languages. A topic that I've been working on for many years. Let me see. I don't know how this interface works. First, let me just mention some of the former students with whom I've collaborated on the studies that I'll be talking about today. You see their names there. So some of them I encourage you to hire. This one in particular speaks wonderful French. So keep an eye on him. So I want to talk about some of the properties that are shared by signed and spoken languages and some of the properties that differentiate signed and spoken languages. And first, please tell me to slow down if I'm going too fast. And if you have any questions of clarification because of all the languages that we're using here, please stop me. So first, signed and spoken languages, as I think most of you probably know, share many properties. Among them, the property of having learned or conventional vocabularies, the property of having words and signs that are built up of meaningless phonological units, that is, they have duality of patterning. Signed and spoken languages have mechanisms for adding new vocabulary, including derivational morphology, compounding, and borrowing. And signed and spoken languages have similar rules for forming sentences, for combining signs or words to form sentences. Well, in light of the fact that signed and spoken languages share so many properties, we might wonder whether, and we can conclude from the fact that so many properties are shared, that there are two major language modalities, two major transmission channels for human language. So already we know from the last 30 or 40 years of linguistic research on ASL, on LSQ, on other languages, that there are two transmission channels in which languages can be produced. So now that we accept that first major point, we could ask whether the human language capacity has a favorite. So does it, for example, prefer spoken languages? So some evidence that might lead us to think that there is a preference for spoken languages has to do with the ubiquity of spoken languages. So every hearing community has a spoken language as its primary language. We have evidence that humans and speech have co-evolved, such that the structure of the human vocal tract has changed from that of the primate vocal tract to allow clear speech, to allow the production of a range of speech sounds that's clear, that's true of human languages. But those changes in the structure of the human vocal tract have been at the risk of aspirating our food, a risk that other species don't suffer to the degree that we do. So we might have some reason to think that the human language capacity somehow has a preference for speech. And then that raises the following question. do children expect languages to be spoken? Is the acquisition of sign languages therefore delayed? So I'm going to ask that question. So, and we can get at that question by looking at milestones of language development. And we find, contrary to this notion that the acquisition of sign might be delayed, given the ubiquity of spoken languages, given evidence that there's evolutionary changes in the human vocal tract to support speech. Now we look at the developmental milestones of the acquisition of sign, developmental milestones for the acquisition of speech, and we find that these two language types are acquired on very similar schedules. So first words, first signs appear at approximately 12 months. First two-word or two-sign combinations appear at 18 months. Find that phenomena such as verb agreement in ASL and in English is controlled at around 3 to 3.5 in both that sign language and in that spoken language. We find in sign as in speech that some linguistic properties are acquired late, at age 5 or later. So in sign, for example, full control of handshake, which requires substantial fine motor control, doesn't come till probably about age 5. There are complex verbs of motion that take some time for children to acquire. So when we look across this developmental schedule, we find that signed and spoken languages are acquired on much the same schedule, contrary to this notion that there might be some particular preference in the language learning capacity for speech over sign. So now, looking then still at milestones of language development, we find no evidence whatsoever that the acquisition of sign languages is ever delayed vis-a-vis spoken languages. Quite to the contrary, the only debate on the relative timing of language milestones has concerned whether or not certain milestones might be earlier in sign than in speech. A surprising fact that there has been that debate. So there's been a controversial claim that the first sign milestone precedes the first word milestone by a month or a month and a half. Most recent data on this topic from Anderson and Riley suggests that before 18 months, signing children have larger vocabularies than speaking children on the MacArthur Communicative Development Inventory. So that's really quite surprising. Despite the suggestion, or not unreasonable hypothesis, that we might expect children to be biased towards speech by virtue of the ubiquity of spoken languages, by virtue of the evolutionary facts that seem to suggest that the humans as a species have evolved in terms of their vocal tract to be able to support clear speech. Nonetheless, when we look at the acquisition of sign languages, we find that they are acquired on the same schedule, and if anything, if there's ever a difference between the two modalities, it may favor sign over speech. So, a surprising conclusion. So, the conclusion already that I'd like to draw is that the evidence on developmental milestones in sign and in speech, this evidence that I've reviewed now, suggests the enormous plasticity, the crucial plasticity of the human language learning capacity. And that's something that should continue to surprise us, that the capacity is as plastic as it is, that there are two major language modalities. There may be a third language modality that's available to humans, and that might be a tactile gestural modality as used in deafblind signing. So language is not restricted by any means to one modality. It's certainly not restricted to the speech modality. So why examine the acquisition of sign languages? Well, there are a variety of reasons why we might want to do so. One has to do with the rather unique demography of signing communities. In North America, 5 to 10% of deaf children have deaf parents. For those children, and those are the children that I'm going to focus on in my research, my talk today, they have early linguistic exposure to a sign language. From day one, they are exposed to a sign language at home. Whether it's ASL in the United States or LSQ here in Montreal, they are exposed to a sign language from day one. The larger fraction of deaf children, 90 to 95%, are born to hearing parents. And for most deaf children, there is therefore a break in the generation-to-generation transmission of language. The hearing parents have not expected a deaf child in all likelihood. They do not use sign language. The child can't hear the spoken language produced in the environment, and so there is a break in the transmission of, say, French in Montreal. So we have an interesting issue then. How does language development proceed for deaf children of hearing parents? And I'll just refer in passing here to 3 kinds of important studies that have been done on deaf children of hearing parents that have explored this fact that there is a break in the generation-to-generation transmission of language. One set of studies, those done by Susan Golden Meadow and her colleagues at the University of Chicago, have looked at the development of language-like home sign systems. These are invented gestural systems that isolated deaf children of hearing parents develop in the home. Many of these parents are not very cooperative in using gesture. They may have been instructed not to gesture with their children. But nonetheless, the child may develop a language-like system, develop a vocabulary of signs or gestures, may combine those signs to form simple sentences. It's quite remarkable that children in isolation from any conventional language will nonetheless go on and combine these invented gestures to form simple gesture strings, simple sentences, and there are interesting word order syntactic regularities in the structures of these strings. A second kind of study that can be done, that has been done, looking at this population, looks at the fact that for deaf children of hearing parents, they may have delayed exposure to a conventional sign language. So that their first exposure to a standard sign language like ASL or LSQ may come at age 5 or at age 10 or at age 15. And these constitute important tests of the critical period hypothesis. So what happens when the first exposure to a language comes at a late age? And in fact, these are probably the best tests of the critical period hypothesis with first language learners. Most tests of the critical period hypothesis are rather indirect and must be done with second language learners. The only interesting tests with large subject populations that can be done on delayed exposure to a first language come with these tests with the studies of deaf children of hearing parents. And many of those studies, as probably you know, were done here in Montreal by Rachel Mayberry at McGill. So a third class of studies has to do with linguistic innovation by successive cohorts of children. So in countries like Nicaragua, it appears that there was no sign language until 1977, that successive groups of children, all of whom were deaf children of hearing parents, joined the School for the Deaf there, entered a School for the Deaf in Managua, and it is those children who seem to have been responsible for the grammaticization, for the development of Nicaraguan Sign Language. And Annie Singas and Marie Coppola have looked at how the sign language has developed over successive cohorts of children, has become more elaborated over successive cohorts. So there's one class of reasons for looking at the acquisition of sign languages, and that is to look at their very unique demography and to take advantage of their very unique demography. Now, a second class of reasons one class of reasons that I'm going to say more about, the second class of reasons for looking at the acquisition of sign and spoken languages is that they differ in how they are produced and perceived. These modality differences may have implications for language development. So how do signed and spoken languages differ? Well, one respect is that the manual articulators move in a transparent three-dimensional space, whereas the oral articulators are largely hidden from view. So obviously one can see a speaker's lips, can see a little bit of tongue movement, but you see much too little information to support lip reading or speech reading. So there just isn't enough visual information to support speech reading. A second difference between sign and speech is probably because of properties of the speech modality, that speech has a very limited capacity for iconicity. That is, for imagistic representation in speech. Sign, I think, has a much richer capacity for iconic representation. A third way in which the manual articulators differ from the oral articulators is that the manual articulators are relatively massive and execute long movement excursions. And as Klima and Belugi suggested, this may have consequences for the rate of signing, and it may also have consequences for linguistic organization in sign languages. So the sign languages may generally opt for a more simultaneous morphological organization in lieu of the more sequential morphological organization that is typical of spoken languages. So these kinds of differences between sign and speech may place different constraints on the learner, on the child, and may offer different resources to the child. And what I'm going to look at then for the balance of the talk is then how is the learning of words and signs effective? So I'm going to talk about 3 studies of early sign learning. One has to do with properties of child-directed signing. A second has to do with iconicity and infant sign production. And a third has to do with some motoric constraints on infant sign production. I'd like to also have talked about some preliminary data having to do with visual perspective taking and sign production by deaf autistic children. But I can't really go into that here. If we have time, maybe we could talk about that in a question time. So let me talk about child-directed signing. One interesting property of sign languages is that the sign label and its referent, so a label like the ASL sign ball, the label and its referent are available to the child through a single sensory modality. The child sees the ball, the child also sees a sign ball. Spoken labels and their reference are generally presented in distinct sensory modalities. That is, the label is presented through audition. The labeled object, the referent, is available visually. So one fact of sign acquisition then is that the sign and its referent must compete for the infant's limited visual attention. So somehow the child has to learn to look at the object of interest, which may be a nice toy, and then also look to the mother who may be labeling that object. So how do signing parents, so my question here is, how do signing parents make signs visible to their infants? It's interesting that it's been suggested in the sign literature that there are actually differences in the amount of input available to signing children as opposed to speaking children. So Spencer and Harris suggested that there was lower quantity of input, that is, fewer utterances, from deaf mothers to deaf infants than from hearing mothers to hearing infants. Well, why? They suggested that deaf mothers don't sign when their kid isn't looking. So, obviously not. Actually, hearing mothers of deaf infants have problems with this. They do sometimes sign when their infant isn't looking. So hearing mothers who have deaf infants need to be reminded that if they sign when their kid's looking down at the floor, the kid won't see the sign. So what Spencer and Harris suggested was that the lower rate of sign communications seems to be another natural consequence of deaf mothers' sensitivity to their child's immature patterns of visual attention. So it's interesting that, despite this suggestion in the literature, that there's less quantity of input available to signing children than to speaking children. But this gets back to my earlier point. Still, there's no evidence at any point in development that the acquisition of sign is delayed. So it looks like the acquisition of sign is quite robust. So why is that? Well, one possibility, and this was a possibility suggested by Spencer and Harris, is that perhaps it's not so much the quality, perhaps it's not the quantity of input that matters so much, but the quality of input that matters. So, and that is, it's important to make signs visible to children. And so, one example here that I'm going to show you from a third-generation deaf child named Katie is that here she is looking at a book with her mother. And you'll see that the mother leans into the child's visual field, and the mother attracts Katie's attention from a picture of a duck to the label duck. So the ASL sign for duck being this. So, okay. Does that work? Nope, it doesn't. No. So let me go back. Why did the cursor go over there? Somebody know how I get the cursor back to my computer?
I'm not really a Mac person, but
yeah, I'm a Mac person. It's over here.
Mismatch of Mac versus PC.
Oh, there it goes. All right. Okay. Maybe it's double clicking. Let me see if I can show that again. Okay, here we go. I'll show it one more time since I've been so distracted here. So what you're going to notice is the mother leans into the child's visual field forward, and it helps to be limber. So she leans forward into the child's visual field, making sure if she were behind the child, the signs would not be available to the child. She changes handedness there in order to make the signs visible to the child. So changes from signing with her right hand, I believe, to her left hand. And so let's just see it again. And notice that she very deliberately attracts the child's attention from the picture on the duck on the page to the sign. So she's quite attentive then to the child's pattern of visual attention. What we did is we were interested in looking at this in a study. We looked at longitudinally at 4 third-generation deaf children. We looked at their signing at 9, 13, 18, and 24 months. We coded signs as being repeated, that is, having more cycles, more than would be expected. So instead of perhaps 2 cycles for duck, a mother might produce it with many cycles. We coded a sign as being displaced. So mother might displace a sign like dog in space to move it into the child's line of regard, or perhaps to move it close to the referent. So the mother might sign on the child, that is, actually physically produce the sign on the child, and might lengthen it, that is, a longer movement excursion, lengthen in duration, or a longer movement excursion, as in enlarged. And a significant fraction of the child-directed signings were altered in these ways, 30 to 60%. These modified signs may result from the mother's attempts to gain and retain the child's visual attention. So you saw in that last example that the mother switched handedness in order to make sure that the sign was available to the child. And the mother also leaned forward to make sure that the sign was, the whole stretch of signs were available to the child. But there also may be other discourse functions that may be promoted by these modifications. That is, sometimes the mothers repeat until the child repeats. So the mother keeps on repeating in an interest in getting the child and eliciting repetition from the child. So here, looking more at child-directed signing, I want to show you some examples then of what the mother might do to make sure that a sign is available to the child. So here, I want you, hopefully I'll be able to play this right off the bat. The mother is labeling a series of color blocks down here at the bottom. And you can see that there's a yellow one, one that looks red, but it's going to be labeled as orange, and one that's blue, and one that's green. And so notice how the mother alters the form of the signs to make sure that it's visually accessible to the child. So the sign blue. And there you see the child looking back and forth between the sign and the label, sign and the object, and orange. So there are just a couple points. One you see is that already this child is, I think, 13 or 14 months old. You see that the child is regulating his own visual attention to look from the object of interest and then look towards the sign. And the child is successfully having its attention redirected by the mother there. Secondly, we see that certain kinds of signs, as Julie Bonflay was saying yesterday in her dissertation, some signs are anchored on the body, other signs are produced in space. So a sign like orange is anchored on the body. What's the mother going to do to make that sign visible? For green, you can just produce it in front of the kid, right? Green. So yellow, blue. But orange is anchored on the mouth. So what is the mother going to do in this instance? Well, she makes it on her own mouth. The kid's not going to see. So instead, what this mother and other mothers do is produce it on the child's mouth. So here we see an example where the mother ensures that the sign is visible by signing on the child, and also she ensures that the child gets some tactile information about the form of the sign. So what we see then in looking at child-directed signing is that sign labels and their reference are typically presented within a single sensory channel. This differs from speech. Speaking children may attend simultaneously to a label and its referent without shifting gaze. The mom may label a dog as the child looks at it. In sign, the label and the referent are often viewed sequentially. The signing child, as this child was already learning to do, must shift to visual attention. Parents must redirect the child's attention from referent to label. And this casts some new light on findings in the research literature on word learning, where it's been suggested that parental attempts to redirect a child's attention are very costly and do not promote word learning. So if a mother redirects her child's attention from one object to another object, the child is less successful at learning new vocabulary. But here, presumably, this situation suggests that when the mother is redirecting the child's attention from the object of interest to the sign, it may not be costly. So, because we've already seen that early vocabulary development, if anything, is actually advanced in signing children over speaking children. So, so sign learning is not delayed vis-a-vis word learning, even though children must redirect their visual attention. One possibility is that child-directed signing may be carefully tuned to children's attentional capacities, and certainly some mothers that we have looked at are very, very good at being sensitive to the child's attentional capacities. But there may also be other resources of the visual gestural modality that may contribute to the robustness of early sign development. And one of those resources is iconicity, and that's what I'll turn to now. And there may also be properties of early motor development that may contribute to the robustness of early sign development. So I'm going to focus now on two kinds of explanations for how infants produce signs. And the first hypothesis that the first question that I'd like to address is this: do children seek to enhance the iconicity of signs? So iconic signs are much more frequent than iconic words. Do children actually actively exploit this resource to guide their sign production? And I'm going to be talking only about sign production here. And then I'm going to turn to motoric explanations for children's air types. Sign, as we've already discussed, is produced with very different articulators than speech. What are the motoric constraints and resources of the manual system that are available to young signers? So, as I've already hinted, I'm going to talk about two studies here. One, having to do with iconicity, suggests that children might seek to enhance the transparency of iconic form meaning mappings. And the third study, I'll examine two motoric factors that may determine the form of children's earliest signs. I'm going to look at a database of draw from a database of early signs. These again are 4 third-generation deaf children followed longitudinally from as early as 8 months to as late as 17 months. The children were videotaped bi-weekly at home. I'm also going to very briefly refer to some data on pre-linguistic gesture from 10 children, 5 hearing and 5 deaf. What we did was code up these signs. We identified gestures as being signs, and they were only identified as signs if they were recognizably related to an adult sign and form, and if used in an appropriate context for that adult sign. We coded up the signs on various communicative and articulatory dimensions, including, as we'll see later, some specification of which joints were used when a child articulated a gesture. We'll be talking about a database of 632 sign tokens, that is 632 instances of signs. And the first question that I'd like to ask then is, are children in effect little minds? Are they little Marcel Marceaus? So there's been recent suggestions that iconicity plays an important role in sign acquisition. So Slobin, for example, has suggested that certain kinds of classifier constructions, so-called handling classifiers, are very early in sign development. There have also been discussions of verb agreements suggesting that aspects of that verb agreement the acquisition of verb agreement may in part be determined by iconicity. The hypothesis that I'm going to look at is that children might seek to enhance iconic form meaning mappings. And what I'm going to do is, so the data that I'm going to report are judgments by adult raters of the iconicity of children's productions. And each token was rated on a 5-point scale, such that 1 meant that the child sign was much less iconic than the target sign. 3 indicated it was neutral, no more or less iconic than the adult sign, and 5 being much more iconic than the adult sign. And right off the bat here, you see that the preponderance of children's signs were neutral, that is no more or less iconic than the adult sign. Approximately a third of the signs were less iconic, were judged to be less iconic than the adult target. Only a very small minority of the signs, about 5%, were judged to be somewhat more iconic than the adult target. And here's a typical error produced by a child. So here's a kid at 15 months, and she's going to produce the target sign fall. ASL sign fall. And you'll see the mother back here confirming that sign. And notice what the child does. Do you see the object fall? So what does the kid do? The child produces a form that looks like this. So in lieu of the V handshake, which represents a legged object, the child produces a one-legged sign. So it produces an index finger. And crucially, you notice that in the adult sign, the hand should rotate with respect to a flat surface. That is, there's some object that's falling and landing on its back. In the child sign, you see a repeated downward movement. And the index finger, representing the falling object, stays in contact with the base hand throughout. And you see the base hand itself moves. So the base hand should be stable, and the dominant hand rotates with respect to the base hand. Instead, the two hands move together. So this might be a good representation of falling in California, where the surface, the Earth's surface, may be what shakes. But here in Montreal, where I don't think there are very many earthquakes, it's not going to work so well. So there's still some latent iconicity. There's downward movement. But the fact that the object falls with respect to a surface is lost. The fact that it's a legged object is largely lost. And it also is repeated now, too. Well, there's only one instance of falling, but she now repeats it. So this is an example of a sign that was judged to be less iconic than the adult target. So what we see is overwhelmingly in the children's productions that the children's forms are either neutral with respect to the iconicity of the adult target sign, or they're less iconic. So there were a few examples in which the child did enhance the iconicity of signs. So one is for an example for ice cream, where the child actually licks the back of its hand. So we judge that kind of form to be more iconic than the adult target. But one thing that we notice is, well, maybe we're being too hard on iconicity here as a hypothesis. Let's identify a class of signs where a child could readily enhance the iconicity of signs. Maybe it's just impossible. There's no easy way to enhance the iconicity of these signs. No easy way given the child's capacity. So we identify a class of signs that have two-handed alternatives in ASL. So here's the sign cat, and it has a two-handed variant. And there are a whole bunch of these signs in ASL. So here's the sign horse, and the two-handed form. She doesn't even need me to produce it. Devil with one hand, and devil with two hands. So what the child can do is, because these animals are all symmetrical, they don't just have whiskers on one side, and we presume devils don't just have horns on one side of the head. They could produce a two-handed alternate. And mothers actually sometimes produce a two-handed variant, perhaps because they're seeking to enhance the iconicity of signs. So there are 20 tokens of these signs in our database. The child only has to add in the second hand. That's not really very costly for the child, because sometimes they do add in a second hand when they shouldn't, but they never did. Only one time out of these 20 signs did they ever add in a second hand. So they never basically choose to produce the more iconic, the more transparent variant of these particular signs. Okay, so some conclusions then. Now, so iconicity can't explain the bulk of the children's errors, although we do see some pro-iconic, that is, some more iconic forms, like taste on the tongue here with tongue protrusion. This is consistent with prior results suggesting that iconic signs are not overrepresented in children's early vocabularies, and that children's forms are often less motivated than adult targets. This is true with respect to the pronouns of ASL, with respect to verb agreement, and with regard to classifiers. Yet, what's interesting here is that the iconic resources of the sign modality allow deaf children of hearing parents to innovate home signs. So when deaf children of hearing parents are left to their own devices, when they have to invent a vocabulary without the active collaboration of the parent, they invent iconic signs. Why? Well, presumably iconic signs are the only ones that are going to be understood by the parent. So when a child has no conventional forms in the environment, the child will invent iconic forms as a way of facilitating communication with the parent. But when the child is faced with the task of learning the conventional vocabulary of ASL or of LSQ, in those instances it seems that children don't bias their forms towards iconicity. They don't push them towards more iconic representations, even when they could, as with those two-handed signs for cat. Even where there are two-handed variants available in the lexicon, children aren't particularly biased towards producing those two-handed forms. But on the other hand, it's important to recognize that for children, perhaps somewhat older children, iconicity still remains an important resource for the innovation of languages. So when they're innovating language, they're going to use iconicity in forming a vocabulary. When they're learning conventional forms and they're having to take the conventional form from the environment, there we see very little role for iconicity in their production of signs. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to look elsewhere for explanations of children's air types, and we're going to look to certain kinds of articulatory constraints. How much time do I have? We started a little more time to, we're going to.
You have at least another 20 minutes.
Okay, so, all right, so I'm going to look towards certain kinds of articulatory constraints, and let me, here's just a quick primer about parameters of sign formation. So we have the ASL sign bug, this. Its place of articulation is the nose. It has a hand shape, a 3 hand shape, this hand shape. And the movement is a repeated bending at the second knuckles. So we can talk about 3 major parameters of sign formation. That is the place of the nose, the hand shape being a 3, and the movement here, a repeated bending at the second knuckles. When we look at the accuracy by parameter of sign production, we see that not all parameters are created equal. So that the place of articulation in yellow, children are very successful on place of articulation. That is, they can get their hand to their nose, as probably most mothers are not too happy about sometimes with their kids, that they can get their fingers into their nose, they can also get it to the tip of their nose. So they have no problem reaching their nose. They are relatively successful on movement. They are much less successful on handshake. So when we look across these 3 parameters, we see that one, place of articulation, seems to be acquired very early, and children are really quite reliable on. Handshake takes a lot of time. So this result has also been reported for other sign languages, including Brazilian Sign Language and Spanish Sign Language. The early accuracy on place may help to make children's early signs recognizable. We see a prolonged acquisition of handshake consistent with the high error rate that I just noticed. What I'm going to talk about now is movement, actually. So, and I'm going to talk about 3 trends in infant motor development, 3 trends derived from the early literature on motor development in children, and apply them to the children's early signing. And I'm going to focus on the first and the third here. And these 3 trends, one is cyclicity, that across many motor domains, children exhibit repetitive stereotypic movement patterns. That is, they tend to show repeated movements. The second that I'll have less to say about is that children sometimes have trouble inhibiting their non-dominant hand when they move an object with the dominant hand. So with a 10-month-old child who's playing with a toy truck, you may see the non-dominant hand moving along with the dominant. And the third is proximalization, that development of motor control generally proceeds from proximal articulators, ones close to the torso, to relatively distal ones. Okay. Why these motoric factors? Well, they figure prominently in the motor development literature. For example, a tendency towards cyclicity may be common both to sign and speech, whereas proximalization is likely to be unique to sign. These motoric factors also interact with important properties of the grammatical system of ASL and most other sign languages, I believe. So let me first talk about cyclicity. That is, across many motor domains, children exhibit repetitive stereotypic movement patterns. These repetitive movements are prevalent in early development. So Esther Thalen noticed that children show repetitive kicking on a changing table. They show stereotypic arm waves. So repetitive kicking is typical about 6 months, I believe. We can think of vocal babbling as largely a simple oscillation of the mandible, ba, ba, ba. So opening and closing of the mandible. So it too is a kind of repetitive movement pattern. And in some work on speech that I've done, we see silent vocal babbling in deaf and hearing infants. So that is, instead of ba, 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 children may produce forms that, and they sometimes produce this non-phonated babbling in alternation with vocalized babbling. So they'll produce forms like this, mama. So turn the vocalization on and off in the midst of this repetition of the mandibular oscillation. So we see repetitive movements in a variety of domains, in linguistic domains and in non-linguistic domains. Repeated movement is important in ASL morphology, so that the distinction between repeated and non-repeated movement is a morphological marker of nouns in ASL. So there's a distinction between the ASL sign sit and the ASL sign chair. And the ASL sign chair is repeated. Repeated movements also mark temporal aspect in ASL and in other sign languages. So children have to be able to control the distinction between a one-time movement and a repeated movement if they're going to produce nouns and verbs correctly in ASL. If we look at the cyclicity of meaningless pre-linguistic gestures, that is what we might call manual babbles, we see that for deaf and hearing children alike, the preponderance of these meaningless, non-communicative gestures are repeated. So for deaf children, it happened that the most prevalent gesture type had a single cycle. For hearing children, the most prevalent had 2 cycles, but for both groups, 75% or more of their gestures had repeated movement. So both hearing children who had no sign exposure and deaf children with sign exposure produce these meaningless repetitive gestures, what we might call manual babbles, and they tend overwhelmingly to be repeated. And sometimes you see that the child went as far as 39 cycles, so in the case of one hearing child. So we see the pre-linguistic gestures from deaf and hearing alike, that children prefer, that favor gestures with repeated movement. The hypothesis that I'm going to look at very quickly now is that the properties of pre-linguistic gesture may persist into early signing, just like in the babbling to word transition in speech. And the suggestion then is that children will preserve repetition in adult signs that are multicyclic. That is, if the adult sign is repeated, they're likely to be successful because they favor repetition in their own pre-linguistic gesture. And the children will add repetition to adult signs that are monocyclic. So they may make errors there. If we look at the cyclicity of early signs, just across our whole sample, you see that over 75% of children's early sign productions show repeated movement, more than one cycle of movement. And again, children can go on ad nauseum. One child produces a sign with 37 cycles. So, we now look at children's production of mono and multicyclic signs. That is, we look at children's production of an adult target sign that has just one movement cycle, like the sign give, or an adult target sign that is multicyclic, like the sign ball, that has more than one cycle. Then look at their error rate. You see that children, well, first of all, they're producing more multicyclic signs than they are monocyclic signs, so they're attempting more multicyclic targets. But their error rate is also substantially higher on monocyclic signs than on multicyclic signs. The characteristic error is to produce repeated movement, where single cycle movement would be the target. And here's an example of that. So we have a sign, it's the child attempting this ASL sign, black, black. And the child sign has 3 cycles. So let me show you. And the child makes a bunch of other errors too in the production of this sign. The mother says that's funny. So here's what the child should do, black. And what the kid instead does is push the arm back over the head 3 times. So, and we get similar results for British Sign Language as well. Okay, so already we've seen one kind of tendency in infant sign development that looks to be rooted in properties of infant motor development, that children have a bias towards repeated movement. That's one factor that helps contribute to making fall less iconic, that example earlier. It's one factor that makes fall less iconic than the adult target, which should have a single movement. Instead, the kid does a repeated movement, 3 cycles, I believe. So repetition contributed to the fact that that sign was judged to be less iconic than the adult target. Now for black, again, the child does the same thing. That is, adds repetition. So interestingly, this fact of adding repetition now is a property of early motor development, of early articulatory development. It's true of both language modalities, because we see it at work in early babbling, vocal babbling, where children produce repetitive strings, like ba, ba, ba. And we see it at work in early manual gesture and in early signing. Okay, now the second trend in infant motor development that I'd like to look at is this, and that is proximalization. It's a suggestion that motor control generally proceeds from proximal articulators, those at the shoulder, to distal ones, so at the wrist or finger. So children may use proximal articulators where adults would use more distal ones. So what are some examples of proximalization? Children in the development of walking often drive walking from the hip, when it should be involve much more use of force from the knee and the ankle. So kids will walk like this some of the time, early in walking, with much less force being expended at the knee and the wrist. In the development of writing, instead of an adult will move the pencil across the page using movements of the shoulder, but the actual writing of the letters is done with very small movements of the wrists and fingers. You use the shoulder to drive the hand across the page. Kids early in writing may hold the pencil awkwardly, but may also sketch out the letters using proximal articulators of the arm. When we look at adults, we see that if I asked you to write with your non-dominant hand, you would proximalize. So those of you who are right-handed would proximalize when you attempted to write with your left hand. And the same kind of result shows up in some brain-damaged populations, that when you look at their gesture, that their gesture tends to be proximalized, even in the adult. Okay. So what do I mean by this proximal to distal scale? Well, we can array the signs, we can array the articulators of the arm on a scale from most proximal to the torso, as in the shoulder, to most distal from the torso, as in the second knuckles. And we can find signs in ASL that are produced at each of these joints. So let me demonstrate these signs now. So committee, that's produced at the shoulder. Give, the elbow. Black is a forearm rotation for the radial ulnar joint. Yes, the wrist movement. Bird, first knuckles. And bug, second knuckles. Okay? So we can identify signs that have movement at each of these particular joints of the arm, and that is largely restricted to those particular joints of the arm. We look just at accuracy of joint use by children. We find that there are two, perhaps three joints that look particularly accurate. The second knuckles, I don't want to tend to anymore, really, because there are only 6 tokens there, so there's really insufficient data. And there's a kind of longer story that I could get into about what happens at the second knuckles. But there are 2 joints that are particularly successful, that our children are particularly accurate on. That is the elbow, where they're almost 60% accurate, and the first knuckle here, as in bird, where they are approaching 80% accurate in the sample that we looked at. So that's already a little surprising for this proximalization hypothesis. I suggested that children are going to favor more proximal articulators of the arm, but yet they're quite successful on the first knuckle. So, but what I'm going to, the way in which I'm going to test that hypothesis is not so much by looking at accuracy of joint use, but by where children err. So the specific hypothesis that I want to test is that if a child substitutes an unexpected joint for the target, then children will tend to substitute a joint that is proximal to the target joint. So that is that when they diverge from the adult model, they will diverge up the arm. Okay? So, and that's robustly true. So for a set of substitutions produced by by 4 children, with very little data from 1 child, but all the children show the 3 other children show strong tendencies to favor proximal substitutions over distal substitutions. So when they substitute an unexpected joint for the target joint, they very rarely substitute a more distal articulator of the arm. And so let me show you one example so that you get some idea of what the kids are doing. So here is a child at 12 months who we call Susie, and she's going to produce the ASL sign horse. And the target movement is at the first knuckles, and the output you're going to see is at the wrist. Is that clear? So instead of this, and then there are other errors in there too, handshake, but those aren't. Okay, we even find some examples of very extreme proximalization, and I'll show you one example of this. Here the child is trying to sign the ASL sign kite at 15 months. And she's referring to a picture in a picture book, and notice what she does. So what she does, in lieu of the upward movement of the arm, she rotates, and then this forearm twisting, she moves her torso, so back and forth. We only have 2 or 3 examples like that, but I like them. So we tested proximalization in other ways too. So if we looked at when children omit activity from a particular articulator, and generally when they omit that articulation, this is when a sign involves two target joints, it's always the more distal target joint that gets omitted. There's a much more complicated story with regard to additions when they add an unexpected joint, and that complicated story seems to have to do with the first knuckles and the second knuckles being linked for children. But through this, we identified one class of surprising errors, but otherwise, children tend to proximalize. So the strong tendency in the data is for children to proximalize. So let me just show you this one example, since I mentioned it, of where children add in a distal articulator, and that is for the sign dirty or pig. So they add in, which should have motion here at the first knuckle, and what the kid does is an opening and closing movement of the full hand that involves both the first and second knuckles. When we exclude that phenomenon, even additions tend to be proximalized. So, okay. Now, proximalization is even true of adults, and I'll just show you one example. So we can see proximalizations even in adult learners of a sign language. So here we have actually a German woman to whom we are showing ASL signs, and we are asking her to imitate the ASL sign bug. So I don't know if you could see that, but in lieu of this, she produces this. So proximalization may not just be a phenomenon of infant motor development, it may also be a phenomenon of skill acquisition, even in the adult. Okay. All right, so in summary, what we've seen in these data, where we try to look fairly carefully at children's articulation of signs, is that children show rather good control of two joints early on, the elbow and the first knuckles. There's some evidence for control of the third, that is the shoulder. The overall error pattern is one of proximalization, which has also been, when you look at the literature, attested in the learning of other sign languages, including Finnish and LSQ. We also find one class of distalization errors that I talked about before. But the overall error pattern was one of proximalization. When we put together these data, we find evidence for two rather distinct syllable types early on in children's signing. That is, they can make oscillations of the elbow, half movements, or they can make open-close movements of the whole hand. So two rather distinct types of movements that are available quite early for children. And this may be different from speech, where this early speech development may be largely constrained to oscillation of the mandible, at least on the account of McNeilage and Davis. Now let me just conclude quickly here. We see across these studies some modality effects and non-effects. We see that words and reference are assigned to distinct sensory channels, that signs and reference, however, compete for a single visual channel. Yet we see very similar developmental schedules for sign and speech. Iconicity is much more frequent in sign than in speech, but it seems to have rather minimal effect on infant sign production in ASL. However, iconicity is crucial in allowing children, perhaps somewhat older children, to innovate home sign systems. So it's a crucial resource for those children, but doesn't seem to be a crucial resource for the child learning a conventional sign language. Continuing on this theme of modality effects and non-effects, we see very different articulators in sign and speech, but there are certain motoric tendencies that are shared by infant talkers and infant signers. And one of those motoric tendencies is this bias towards repetitive cyclic movements that Esther Thalen noticed in infant motor development outside of language, and this seems to be true of language development in sign and in speech. Other motoric factors are likely to be modality specific, so proximalization is one motoric factor that is likely to be specific to the manual system. The speech articulators don't have, there isn't a sequence of jointed segments that there are in the arm. We see early control of place of articulation in sign, such that infants can reach to different locations on their bodies and can use that skill early in sign development, and they show a high degree of accuracy on place of articulation from very early on in sign development. We also see early evidence of independent control of 2 or perhaps more articulators in sign, suggesting that there may be 2 early syllable types available to infant signers, and this may contrast to speech, as I just suggested. The early speech may largely be driven by 1 oscillator, the mandible. And lastly, this control of location, a place of articulation that we see in early signers, or control of the elbow and of open-closed movements of the hand, may contribute to making early signs recognizable. And so we got back to coming full circle. We said at the beginning that the developmental schedule on which sign and speech are acquired is essentially the same. But where we saw differences, if they exist, the differences favored sign in the first word milestone, such that early signs, there's some evidence, still controversial, that first signs appear earlier than first words. Well, why might that be? One possibility is that because infants control location and they control a path movement of the arm here with the elbow, and they control open-close movements of the hand, that their early attempts to sign may be more recognizable to parents and experimenters than early attempts to produce speech. And that might be an explanation for this one asynchrony that we see between sign and speech, this one asynchrony that actually favors sign. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.